This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kristen McQuillan, MediaTinker.com, Tokyo, Japan. Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, Chapter 5, Wool and Water. She caught the shawl as she spoke, and looked about for the owner. In another moment the White Queen came running wildly through the wood, with both arms stretched out wide as if she were flying, and Alice very civilly went to meet her with the shawl. "I'm very glad I happened to be in the way," Alice said, as she helped her to put on her shawl again. The White Queen only looked at her in a helpless, frightened sort of way, and kept repeating something in a whisper to herself that sounded like, "Bread and butter, bread and butter." And Alice felt if there was to be any conversation at all, she must manage it herself. So she began rather timidly. "Am I addressing the White Queen?" "Well, yes, if you call that addressing," the Queen said. "It isn't my notion of the thing at all." Alice thought it would never do to have an argument at the very beginning of their conversation, so she smiled and said, "If your Majesty will only tell me the right way to begin, I'll do it as well as I can." "But I don't want it done at all," groaned the poor Queen. "I've been addressing myself for the last 2 hours. It would have been all the better, as it seemed to Alice, if she had got someone else to dress her. She was so dreadfully untidy. "Every single thing's crooked," Alice thought to herself, "and she's all over pins. May I put your shawl straight for you?" she added aloud. "I don't know what's the matter with it," the Queen said in a melancholy voice. "It's out of temper, I think. I've pinned it here and I've pinned it there, but there's no pleasing it." "It can't go straight, you know, if you pin it all on one side," Alice said, as she gently put it right for her. "And dear me, what a state your hair is in!" "The brush has gotten entangled in it," the Queen said with a sigh, "and I lost the comb yesterday." Alice carefully released the brush, and did her best to get the hair into order. "Come, you look rather better now," she said, after altering most of the pins. "But really, you should have a lady's maid." "I'm sure I'll take you with pleasure," the Queen said. "Tuppence a week and jam every other day." Alice couldn't help laughing as she said, "I don't want you to hire me, and I don't care for jam." "It's very good jam," said the Queen. "Well, I don't want any today, at any rate." "You couldn't have it if you did want it," the Queen said. "The rule is jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today." "It must come sometimes to jam today," Alice objected. "No, it can't," said the Queen. "It's jam every other day. Today isn't any other day, you know." "I don't understand you," said Alice. "It's dreadfully confusing." "That's the effect of living backwards," the Queen said kindly. "It always makes one a little giddy at first." "Living backwards?" Alice repeated in great astonishment. "I never heard of such a thing." "But there's one great advantage in it, that one's memory works both ways." "I'm sure mine only works one way," Alice remarked. "I can't remember things before they happen." "It's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards," the Queen remarked. "What sort of things do you remember best?" Alice ventured to ask. "Oh, things that happen the week after next," the Queen replied in a careless tone. "For instance, now," she went on, sticking a large piece of plaster on her finger as she spoke, "there's the King's messenger. He's in prison now, being punished, and the trial doesn't even begin till next Wednesday, and of course the crime comes last of all." "Suppose he never commits the crime?" said Alice. "Well, that would be all the better, wouldn't it?" the Queen said, as she bound the plaster round her finger with a bit of ribbon. Alice felt there was no denying that. "Of course it would be all the better," she said, "but it wouldn't be all the better his being punished." "Oh, you're wrong there, at any rate," said the Queen. "Were you ever punished?" "Only for faults," said Alice. "And you were all the better for it, I know," the Queen said triumphantly. "Yes, but then I had done the things I was punished for," said Alice. "That makes all the difference." "But if you hadn't done them," the Queen said, "that would have been better still. Better and better and better." Her voice went higher with each better, till it got quite to a squeak at last. Alice was just beginning to say, "There's a mistake somewhere," when the Queen began screaming so loud that she had to leave the sentence unfinished. "Oh! Oh! Oh!" shouted the Queen, shaking her hand about as if she wanted to shake it off. "My finger's bleeding! Oh! 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 Oh!" Her screams were so exactly like the whistle of a steam engine that Alice had to hold both her hands over her ears. "What is the matter?" she said, as soon as there was a chance of making herself heard. "Have you pricked your finger?" "I haven't pricked it yet," the Queen said, "but I soon shall. Oh, oh, oh!" "When do you expect to do it?" Alice asked, feeling very much inclined to laugh. "When I fasten my shawl again," the poor Queen groaned out. "The brooch will come undone directly. Oh, oh!" As she said the words, the brooch flew open, and the Queen clutched wildly at it and tried to clasp it again. "Take care!" cried Alice. "You're holding it all crooked!" And she caught at the brooch, but it was too late. The pin had slipped, and the Queen had pricked her finger. "That accounts for the bleeding, you see," she said to Alice with a smile. "Now you understand the way things happen here." "But why don't you scream now?" Alice asked, holding her hands ready to put over her ears again. "Why, I've done all the screaming already," said the Queen. "What would be the good of having it all over again?" By this time it was getting light. "The crow must have flown away, I think," said Alice. "I'm so glad it's gone. I thought it was the night coming on." "I wish I could manage to be glad," the Queen said, "only I never can remember the rule. You must be very happy living in this wood and being glad whenever you like." "Only it is so very lonely here," Alice said in a melancholy voice, and at the thought of her loneliness, 2 large tears came rolling down her cheeks. "Oh, don't go on like that," cried the poor Queen, wringing her hands in despair. "Consider what a great girl you are. Consider what a long way you've come today. Consider what o'clock it is. Consider anything, only don't cry." Alice could not help laughing at this, even in the midst of her tears. "Can you keep from crying by considering things?" she asked. "That's the way it's done," the Queen said with great decision. "Nobody can do 2 things at once, you know. Let's consider your age to begin with. How old are you?" "I'm 7½ exactly." "You needn't say exactually," the Queen remarked. "I can believe it without that. Now I'll give you something to believe. I'm just 101 5 months and a day." "I can't believe that," said Alice. "Can't you?" the Queen said in a pitying tone. "Try again. Draw a long breath and shut your eyes." Alice laughed. "There's no use trying," she said. "One can't believe impossible things." "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. There goes the shawl again." The brooch had come undone as she spoke, and a sudden gust of wind blew the Queen's shawl across a little brook. The Queen spread out her arms again and went flying after it, and this time she succeeded in catching it for herself. "I've got it!" she cried in a triumphant tone. "Now you shall see me pin it on again, all by myself." "Then I hope your finger is better now," Alice said very politely, as she crossed the little brook after the Queen. "Oh, much better!" cried the Queen, her voice rising to a squeak as she went on. "Much better, 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 better." The last word ended in a long bleat, so like a sheep that Alice was quite startled. She looked at the Queen, who seemed to have suddenly wrapped herself up in wool. Alice rubbed her eyes and looked again. She couldn't make out what had happened at all. Was she in a shop? And was it really a sheep that was sitting on the other side of the counter? Rub as she could make nothing more of it. She was in a little dark shop, leaning with her elbows on the counter, and opposite to her was an old sheep, sitting in an armchair knitting, and every now and then leaving off to look at her through a great pair of spectacles. "What is it you want to buy?" the sheep said at last, looking up for a moment from her knitting. "I don't quite know yet," Alice said very gently. "I should like to look all round me first, if I might." "You may look in front of you, and on both sides if you like," said the sheep, "but you can't look all round you, unless you've got eyes in the back of your head." But these, as it happened, Alice had not got, so she contented herself with turning round, looking at the shelves as she came to them. The shop seemed to be full of all manner of curious things, but the oddest part of it all was that whenever she looked hard at any shelf to make out exactly what it had on it, that particular shelf was always quite empty, though the others round it were crowded as full as they could hold. "Things flow about so here," she said, at last, in a plaintive tone, after she had spent a minute or so in vainly pursuing a large bright thing that looked sometimes like a doll and sometimes like a workbox, and was always in the shelf next above the one she was looking at. And this is one of the most provoking of all. I'll tell you what, she added, as a sudden thought struck her. I'll follow it up to the very top shelf of all. It'll puzzle it to go through the ceiling, I expect. But even this plan failed. The thing went through the ceiling as quietly as possible, as if it were quite used to it. Are you a child or a teetotum? The sheep said, as she took up another pair of needles. You'll make me giddy soon if you go on turning round like that. She was now working with 15 pairs at once, and Alice couldn't help look at her in great astonishment. How can she knit with so many? The puzzled child thought to herself. She gets more and more like a porcupine every minute. Can you row? The sheep asked, handing her a pair of knitting needles as she spoke. Yes, a little, but not on land and not with needles, Alice was beginning to say, when suddenly the needles turned into oars in her hands, and she found they were in a little boat, gliding along between banks, so there was nothing for it but to do her best. Feather! Cried the sheep, as she took up another pair of needles. This didn't sound like a remark that needed any answer, so Alice said nothing but pulled away. There was something very queer about the water, she thought, as every now and again the oars got fast in it and would hardly come out again. Feather! Feather! The sheep cried again, taking more needles. You'll be catching a crab directly. A dear little crab, thought Alice. I should like that. Didn't you hear me say feather? The sheep cried angrily, taking up quite a bunch of needles. Indeed I did, said Alice. You've said it very often and very loud. Please, where are the crabs? In the water, of course, said the sheep, sticking some of the needles into her hair as her hands were full. Feather, I say. Why do you say feather so often? Alice asked at last, rather vexed. I'm not a bird. You are, said the sheep. You're a little goose. This offended Alice a little, so there was no more conversation for a minute or two, while the boat glided gently on, sometimes among beds of weeds, which made the oars stick fast in the water worse than ever, and sometimes under trees, but always with the same tall river banks frowning over their heads. Oh, please, there are some scented rushes, Alice cried in a sudden transport of delight. There really are, and such beauties. You needn't say please to me about 'em, the sheep said, without looking up from her knitting. I didn't put 'em there, and I'm not going to take 'em away. No, but I meant, please may we wait and pick some, Alice pleaded, if you don't mind stopping the boat for a minute. How am I to stop it, said the sheep. If you leave off rowing, it'll stop of itself. So the boat was left to drift down the stream as it would, till it glided gently in among the waving rushes. And then the little sleeves were carefully rolled up, and the little arms were plunged in elbow deep to get the rushes a good long way down before breaking them off. But for a while Alice forgot all about the sheep and the knitting, as she bent over the side of the boat, with just the ends of her tangled hair dipping into the water, while with bright eager eyes she caught at one bunch after another of the darling scented rushes. I only hope the boat won't tipple over, she said to herself. Oh, what a lovely one! I couldn't quite reach it. And it certainly did seem a little provoking, almost as if it happened on purpose, she thought, that, though she managed to pick plenty of beautiful rushes as the boat glided by, there was always a more lovely one that she couldn't reach. The prettiest are always further, she said at last, with a sigh at the obstinacy of the rushes in growing so far off, as, with flushed cheeks and dripping hair and hands, she scrambled back into her place and began to arrange her new-found treasures. What mattered it to her just then that the rushes had begun to fade and lose all their scent and beauty from the very moment that she picked them? Even real scented rushes, you know, last only a very little while, and these, being dream rushes, melted away almost like snow as they lay in heaps at her feet. But Alice hardly noticed this. There were so many other curious things to think about. They hadn't gone much farther before the blade of one of the oars got fast in the water and wouldn't come out again, so Alice explained it afterward, and the consequence was that the handle of it caught her under the chin, and in spite of a series of little shrieks of "Oh, oh, oh!" from poor Alice, it swept her straight off the seat and down among the heap of rushes. However, she wasn't hurt, and was soon up again. The sheep went on with her knitting all the while, just as if nothing had happened. That was a nice crab you caught, she remarked, as Alice got back into her place, very much relieved to find herself still in the boat. Was it? I didn't see it, said Alice, peeping cautiously over the side of the boat into the dark water. I wish it hadn't let go. I should so like to see a little crab to take home with me. But the sheep only laughed scornfully, and went on with her knitting. Are there many crabs here? Said Alice. Crabs and all sorts of things, said the sheep. Plenty of choice. Only make up your mind. Now what do you want to buy? To buy? Alice echoed in a tone that was half astonished and half frightened, for the oars and the boat and the river had vanished all in a moment, and she was back again in the little dark shop. "I should like to buy an egg, please," she said timidly. "How do you sell them?" "5 farthing for one, 2 for 2, the sheep replied. "Then 2 are cheaper than 1? Alice said in a surprised tone, taking out her purse. "Only you must eat them both if you buy 2, said the sheep. "Then I'll have 1, please," said Alice, as she put the money down on the counter, for she thought to herself, "They mightn't be at all nice, you know." The sheep took the money and put it away in a box, and then she said, "I never put things into people's hands. That would never do. You must get it for yourself." And so saying, she went off to the other end of the shop and set the egg upright on a shelf. "I wonder why it wouldn't do," thought Alice, as she groped her way among the tables and chairs, for the shop was very dark towards the end. "The egg seems to get further away the more I walk towards it. Let me see, is this a chair? Why, it's got branches, I declare. How very odd to find trees growing here. And actually, here's a little brook. Well, this is the very queerest shop I ever saw." So she went on, wondering more and more at every step, as everything turned into a tree the moment she came up to it, and she quite expected the egg to do the same. End of chapter 5.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alessia. Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, Chapter 6. Humpty Dumpty. However, the egg only got larger and larger, and more human. When she had come within a few yards of it, she saw that it had eyes and a nose and mouth. And when she had come close to it, she saw clearly that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. "It can't be anybody else," she said to herself. "I'm as certain of it as if his name were written all over his face. It might have been written 100 times easily on that enormous face." Humpty Dumpty was sitting with his legs crossed like a Turk on the top of a high wall, such a narrow one that Alice quite wondered how he could keep his balance, and as his eyes were steadily fixed in the opposite direction, and he didn't take the least notice of her, she thought he must be a stuffed figure after all. "And how exactly like an egg he is," she said aloud, standing with her hands ready to catch him, for she was every moment expecting him to fall. "It's very provoking," Humpty Dumpty said after a long silence, looking away from Alice as he spoke. "To be called an egg. Very." "I said you look like an egg, sir," Alice gently explained. "And some eggs are very pretty, you know," she added, hoping to turn her remark into a sort of a compliment. "Some people," said Humpty Dumpty, looking away from her as usual, "have no more sense than a baby." Alice didn't know what to say to this. It wasn't at all like conversation, she thought, as he never said anything to her. In fact, his last remark was evidently addressed to a tree, so she stood and softly repeated to herself, "Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty in his place again." That last line is much too long for the poetry, she added, almost out loud, forgetting that Humpty Dumpty would hear her. Don't stand there chattering to yourself like that, Humpty Dumpty said, looking at her for the first time. But tell me your name and your business. My name is Alice, but it's a stupid enough name, Humpty Dumpty interrupted impatiently. What does it mean? Must a name mean something? Alice asked doubtfully. Of course it must, Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh. My name means the shape I am, and a good handsome shape it is, too. With a name like yours, you might be any shape, almost. Why do you sit out here all alone? Said Alice, not wishing to begin an argument. Why, because there's nobody with me, cried Humpty Dumpty. Did you think I didn't know the answer to that? Ask another. Don't you think you'd be safer down on the ground? Alice went on, not with any idea of making another riddle, but simply in her good-natured anxiety for the queer creature. That wall is so very narrow. What tremendously easy riddles you ask, Humpty Dumpty growled out. Of course I don't think so. Why, if ever I did fall off, which there's no chance of, but if I did. Here he pursed his lips and looked so solemn and grand that Alice could hardly help laughing. If I did fall, he went on, the king has promised me with his very own mouth to send all his horses and all his men, Alice interrupted, rather unwisely. Now I declare that's too bad, Humpty Dumpty cried, breaking into a sudden passion. You've been listening at doors and behind trees, and down chimneys, or you couldn't have known it. I haven't, indeed, Alice said very gently. It's in a book. Ah, well, they may write such things in a book, Humpty Dumpty said in a calmer tone. That's what you call a history of England, that is. Now, take a good look at me. I'm one that has spoken to a king. I am. Mayhap you'll never see such another. And to show you I'm not proud, you may shake hands with me. And he grinned almost from ear to ear as he leaned forward, and as nearly as possible fell off the wall in doing so, and offered Alice his hand. She watched him a little anxiously as she took it. If he smiled much more, the ends of his mouth might meet behind, she thought, and then I don't know what would happen to his head. I'm afraid it would come off. Yes, all his horses and all his men, Humpty Dumpty went on. They'd pick me up again in a minute. They would. However, this conversation is going on a little too fast. Let's go back to the last remark but one. I'm afraid I can't quite remember it, Alice said very politely. In that case, we start fresh, said Humpty Dumpty, and it's my turn to choose a subject. He talks about it just as if it was a game, thought Alice. So here's a question for you. How old did you say you were?" Alice made a short calculation and said, 7 years and 6 months. "Wrong!" Humpty Dumpty exclaimed triumphantly. "You never said a word like it." "I thought you meant, how old are you?" Alice explained. "If I'd meant that, I'd have said it," said Humpty Dumpty. Alice didn't want to begin another argument, so she said nothing. 7 years and 6 months, Humpty Dumpty repeated thoughtfully. "An uncomfortable sort of age. Now, if you'd asked my advice, I'd have said leave off at 7, but it's too late now." "I never asked advice about growing," Alice said indignantly. "Too proud?" the other inquired. Alice felt even more indignant at this suggestion. "I mean," she said, "that one can't help growing older." "One can't, perhaps," said Humpty Dumpty, "but two can. With proper assistance you might have left off at 7. "What a beautiful belt you've got on," Alice suddenly remarked. They had had quite enough of the subject of age, she thought, and if they really were to take turns in choosing subjects, it was her turn now. At least, she corrected herself on second thoughts, a beautiful cravat. "I should have said, no, belt, I beg your pardon," she added in dismay, for Humpty Dumpty looked thoroughly offended, and she began to wish she hadn't chosen that subject. "If I only knew," she thought to herself, "which was neck and which was waist." Evidently Humpty Dumpty was very angry, though he said nothing for a minute or two. When he did speak again, it was in a deep growl. "It is a most provoking thing," he said at last, "when a person doesn't know a cravat from a belt." "I know it's very ignorant of me," Alice said, in so humble a tone that Humpty Dumpty relented. "It's a cravat, child, and a beautiful one, as you say. It's a present from the White King and Queen. There now." "Is it really?" said Alice, quite pleased to find that she had chosen a good subject after all. "They gave it me," Humpty Dumpty continued thoughtfully, as he crossed one knee over the other and clasped his hands around it. "They gave it me for an on-birthday present." "I beg your pardon?" Alice said with a puzzled air. "I'm not offended," said Humpty Dumpty. What is an on-birthday present?" "A present given when it isn't your birthday, of course." Alice considered a little. "I like birthday presents best," she said at last. "You don't know what you're talking about," cried Humpty Dumpty. "How many days are there in a year?" 365, said Alice. "And how many birthdays have you?" 1. "And if you take 1 from 365, what remains?" 364, of course. Humpty Dumpty looked doubtful. "I'd rather see that done on paper," he said. Alice couldn't help smiling as she took out her memorandum book and worked the sum for him. 365 minus 1 equal 364. Humpty Dumpty took the book and looked at it carefully. "That seems to be done right," he began. "You're holding it upside down," Alice interrupted. "To be sure I was," Humpty Dumpty said gaily, as she turned it round for him. "I thought it looked a little queer, as I was saying that seems to be done right, though I haven't time to look it over thoroughly just now, and that shows that there are 364 days when you might get on birthday presents." "Certainly," said Alice, "and only one for birthday presents, you know. There's glory for you." "I don't know what you mean by glory," Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. "Of course you don't. Till I tell you. I mean, there's a nice knockdown argument for you." "But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument," Alice objected. "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said in rather a scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." "The question is," said Humpty Dumpty, "which is to be master, that's all." Alice was too much puzzled to say anything. So after a minute, Humpty Dumpty began again. "They've a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can manage the whole lot of them. Impenetrability, that's what I say." "Would you tell me, please," said Alice, "what that means?" "Now you talk like a reasonable child," said Humpty Dumpty, looking very much pleased. "I meant by impenetrability that we've had enough of that subject, and it would be just as well if you'd mention what you mean to do next, as I suppose you don't mean to stop here all the rest of your life." "That's a great deal to make one word mean," Alice said in a thoughtful tone. "When I make a word do a lot of work like that," said Humpty Dumpty, "I always paid it extra." "Oh," said Alice. She was too much puzzled to make any other remark. "You should see 'em come round me of a Saturday night," Humpty Dumpty went on, wagging his head gravely from side to side, "for to get their wages, you know." Alice didn't venture to ask what he paid them with, and so you see I can tell you. "You seem very clever at explaining words, sir," said Alice. "Would you kindly tell me the meaning of the poem called Jabberwocky?" "Let's hear it," said Humpty Dumpty. "I can explain all the poems that were ever invented, and a good many that haven't been invented just yet." This sounded very hopeful, so Alice repeated the first verse. "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toads did gear and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome rats outgrabe." "That's enough to begin with," Humpty Dumpty interrupted. There are plenty of hard words there. Brillig means 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the time when you begin broiling things for dinner. That will do very well, said Alice. And slithy? Well, slithy means lithe and slimy. Lithe is the same as active. You see, it's like a portmanteau. There are 2 meanings packed up into one word. I see it now, Alice remarked thoughtfully. And what are toads? Well, toads are something like badgers. There's something like lizards. And there's something like corkscrews. They must be very curious-looking creatures. They are that, said Humpty Dumpty. Also, they make their nests under sundials. Also, they live on cheese. And what's the gyre and to gimble? To gyre is to go round and round like a gyroscope. To gimble is to make holes like a gimlet. And the wave is the grass plot round the sundial, I suppose, said Alice, surprised at her own ingenuity. Of course it is. It's called wave, you know, because it goes a long way before it and a long way behind it. And a long way beyond it on each side, Alice added. Exactly so. Well, then, Mimsy is flimsy and miserable. There's another portmanteau for you. And a borogove is a thin, shabby-looking bird with its feathers sticking out all around. Something like a blivmop. And then mome rats, said Alice. I'm afraid I'm giving you a great deal of trouble. Well, a rat is a sort of green pig, but mome I'm not certain about. I think it's short for from home, meaning that they lost their way, you know. And what does outgrabe mean? Well, outgrabing is something between bellowing and whistling, with a kind of sneeze in the middle. However, you'll hear it down, maybe down in the wood yonder, and when you once heard it, you'll be quite content. Who's been repeating all that hard stuff to you? I read it in a book, said Alice, but I had some poetry repeated to me, much easier than that, by Tweedledee, I think it was. As to poetry, you know, said Humpty Dumpty, stretching out one of his great hands, I can repeat poetry as well as other folk, if it comes to that. Oh, it needn't come to that, Alice hastily said, hoping to keep him from beginning. The piece I'm going to repeat, he went on without noticing her remark, was written entirely for your amusement. Alice felt that in that case she really ought to listen to it. So she sat down and said, Thank you rather sadly. In winter, when the fields are white, I sing this song for your delight. Only I don't sing it, he added, as an explanation. I see you don't, said Alice. If you can't see whether I'm singing or not, you've sharper eyes than most, Humpty Dumpty remarked severely. Alice was silent. In spring, when woods are getting green, I'll try and tell you what I mean. Thank you very much, said Alice. In summer, when the days are long, perhaps you'll understand the song. In autumn, when the leaves are brown, take pen and ink and write it down. I will, if I can remember it so long, said Alice. You needn't go on making remarks like that, Humpty Dumpty said. They're not sensible, and they put me out. I sent a message to the fish. I told them, this is what I wish. The little fishes of the sea, they sent an answer back to me. The little fishes' answer was, we cannot do it, sir, because. I'm afraid I didn't quite understand, said Alice. It gets easier further on, Humpty Dumpty replied. I sent to them again to say, it will be better to obey. The fishes answered with a grin, why, what a temper you are in! I told them once, I told them twice, they would not listen to advice. I took a kettle large and new, fit for the deed I had to do. My heart went hop, my heart went thump, I filled the kettle at the pump. Then someone came to me and said, the little fishes are in bed. I said to him, I said it plain, then you must wake them up again. I said it very loud and clear, I went and shouted in his ear. Humpty Dumpty raised his voice almost to a scream as he repeated this verse, and Alice thought with a shudder, I wouldn't have been the messenger for anything. But he was very stiff and proud. He said, you needn't shout so loud. And he was very proud and stiff. He said, I'd go and wake them if. I took a corkscrew from the shelf. I went to wake them up myself. And when I found the door was locked, I pulled and pushed and kicked and knocked. And when I found the door was shut, I tried to turn the handle, but there was a long pause. Is that all? Alice timidly asked. That's all, said Humpty Dumpty. Goodbye. This was rather sudden, Alice thought, but after such a very strong hint that she ought to be going, she felt that it would hardly be civil to stay. So she got up and held out her hand. Goodbye, till we meet again, she said as cheerfully as she could. I shouldn't know you again if we did meet, Humpty Dumpty replied in a discontented tone, giving her one of his fingers to shake. You are so exactly like other people. The face is what one goes by generally, Alice remarked in a thoughtful tone. That's just what I complain of, said Humpty Dumpty. Your face is the same as everybody has. The two eyes, though, making their places in the air with this thumb. Nose in the middle, mouth under. It's always the same. Now if you had the two eyes on the same side of the nose, for instance, or the mouth at the top, that would be some help. It wouldn't look nice, Alice objected, but Humpty Dumpty only shut his eyes and said, Wait till you've tried. Alice waited a minute to see if he would speak again, but as he never opened his eyes or took any further notice of her, she said goodbye once more, and, getting an answer to this, she quietly walked away. But she couldn't help saying to herself as she went, Of all the unsatisfactory, she repeated this aloud, as it was a great comfort to have such a long word to say. Of all the unsatisfactory people I ever met. She never finished the sentence, for at this moment a heavy crash shook the forest from end to end. End of chapter 6.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alice Still, Biggleswade, England. Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. Chapter 7. The Lion and the Unicorn. The next moment, soldiers came running through the wood. At first in 2s and 3s, then 10 or 20 together, and at last in such crowds that they seemed to fill the whole forest. Alice got behind a tree for fear of being run over, and watched them go by. She thought that in all her life she had never seen soldiers so uncertain on their feet. They were always tripping over something or other, and whenever one went down, several more always fell over him, so that the ground was soon covered with little heaps of men. Then came the horses. Having 4 feet, these managed rather better than the foot soldiers, but even they stumbled now and then, and it seemed to be a regular rule that whenever a horse stumbled, the rider fell off instantly. The confusion got worse every moment, and Alice was very glad to get out of the wood into an open place, where she found the White King seated on the ground, busily writing in his memorandum book. "I've sent them all," the King cried in a tone of delight on seeing Alice. "Did you happen to meet any soldiers, my dear, as you came through the wood?" "Yes, I did," said Alice. "Several thousand, I should think." 4,207. That's the exact number, the King said, referring to his book. "I couldn't send all the horses, you know, because 2 of them are wanted in the game, and I haven't sent the 2 messengers either. They are both gone to the town. Just look along the road and tell me if you can see either of them." "I see nobody on the road," said Alice. "I only wish I had such eyes," the King remarked in a fretful tone. "To be able to see nobody, and at that distance too. Why, it's as much as I can do to see real people by this light." All this was lost on Alice, who was still looking intently along the road, shading her eyes with one hand. "I see somebody now," she exclaimed at last, "but he's coming very slowly, and what curious attitudes he goes into." For the messenger kept skipping up and down, and wriggling like an eel as he came along, with his great hands spread out like fans on each side. "Not at all," said the King. "He's an Anglo-Saxon messenger, and those are Anglo-Saxon attitudes. He only does them when he's happy. His name is Heya." He pronounced it so as to rhyme with mare. "I love my love with an H," Alice couldn't help beginning, "because he is happy. I hate him with an H because he is hideous. I fed him with ham sandwiches and hay. His name is Heya, and he lives on the hill," the King remarked simply, without the least idea that he was joining in the game, while Alice was still hesitating for the name of a town beginning with H. "The other messenger's called Hatta. I must have 2, you know, to come and go. One to come and one to go." "I beg your pardon," said Alice. "It isn't respectable to beg," said the King. "I only meant that I didn't understand," said Alice. "Why one to come and one to go?" "Didn't I tell you?" the King repeated impatiently. "I must have 2 to fetch and carry. One to fetch and one to carry." At this moment the messenger arrived. He was far too much out of breath to say a word, and could only wave his hands about and make the most fearful faces at the poor King. "This young lady loves you with an H," the King said. introducing Alice in the hope of turning off the messenger's attention from himself. But it was no use. The Anglo-Saxon attitudes only got more extraordinary every moment, while the great eyes rolled wildly from side to side.
"You alarm me," said the king. "I feel faint. Give me a ham sandwich."
On which the messenger, to Alice's great amusement, opened a bag that hung round his neck and handed a sandwich to the king, who devoured it greedily.
"Another sandwich," said the king.
"There's nothing but hay left now,"
the messenger said, peeping into the bag.
"Hay, then,"
the king murmured in a faint whisper. Alice was glad to see that it revived him a good deal.
"There's nothing like eating hay when you're faint," he remarked to her as he munched away.
"I should think throwing cold water over you would be better," Alice suggested. "Or some sal volatile."
"I didn't say there was nothing better," the king replied. "I said there was nothing like it."
Which Alice did not venture to deny.
"Who did you pass on the road?"
the king went on, holding out his hand to the messenger for some more hay.
"Nobody,"
said the messenger.
"Quite right," said the king. "This young lady saw him too. So, of course, nobody walks slower than you."
"I do my best,"
the messenger said in a sulky tone.
"I'm sure nobody walks much faster than I do."
"He can't do that," said the king, "or else he'd have been here first. However, now you've got your breath, you may tell us what's happened in the town."
"I'll whisper it,"
said the messenger, putting his hands to his mouth in the shape of a trumpet, and stooping so as to get close to the king's ear. Alice was sorry for this, as she wanted to hear the news too. However, instead of whispering, he simply shouted at the top of his voice.
"They're at it again!"
"Do you call that a whisper?"
cried the poor king, jumping up and shaking himself.
"If you do such a thing again, I'll have you buttered. It went through and through my head like an earthquake."
It would have to be a very tiny earthquake, thought Alice. Who were at it again? She ventured to ask.
"Why, the lion and the unicorn, of course," said the king.
Fighting for the crown?
"Yes, to be sure,"
said the king.
"And the best of the joke is that it's my crown all the while. Let's run and see them."
And they trotted off, Alice repeating to herself as she ran the words of the old song. The lion and the unicorn were fighting for the crown. The lion beat the unicorn all round the town. Some gave them white bread, some gave them brown. Some gave them plum cake and drummed them out of town. Does the one that wins get the crown? She asked, as well as she could, for the run was putting her quite out of breath.
"Dear me, no,"
said the king.
"What an idea!"
Would you be good enough, Alice panted out after running a little further, to stop a minute, just to get one's breath again?
"I'm good enough,"
the king said.
"only I'm not strong enough. You see, a minute goes by so fearfully quick. You might as well try to stop a bandersnatch."
Alice had no more breath for talking, so they trotted on in silence, till they came in sight of a great crowd, in the middle of which the lion and the unicorn were fighting. They were in such a cloud of dust that at first Alice could not make out which was which, but she soon managed to distinguish the unicorn by his horn. They placed themselves close to where Hatta, the other messenger, was standing, watching the fight, with a cup of tea in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other.
"He's only just out of prison, and he hadn't finished his tea when he was sent in,"
Haya whispered to Alice.
"and they only give them oyster shells in there. So you see, he's very hungry and thirsty. How are you, dear child?"
he went on, putting his arm affectionately around Hatta's neck. Hatta looked round and nodded, and went on with his of bread and butter.
Were you happy in prison, dear child?
Said Hea. Hatter looked round once more, and this time a tear or two trickled down his cheek, but not a word would he say.
Speak, can't you?
Hea cried impatiently, but Hatter only munched away and drank some more tea.
Speak, won't you?
Cried the king.
How are they getting on with the fight?
Hatter made a desperate effort and swallowed a large piece of bread and butter.
They're getting on very well,
he said in a choking voice.
Each of them has been down about 87 times.
Then I suppose they'll bring the white bread and the brown, Alice ventured to remark.
It's waiting for him now,
said Hatter.
This is a bit of it as I'm eating.
There was a pause in the fight just then, and the Lion and the Unicorn sat down, panting, while the king called out,
10 minutes allowed for refreshments.
Hea and Hatter set to work at once, carrying rough trays of white and brown bread. Alice took a piece to taste, but it was very dry.
I don't think they'll fight any more today, the king said to Hatter. Go and order the drums to begin.
And Hatter went, bounding away like a grasshopper. For a minute or two Alice stood silent, watching him. Suddenly she brightened up. Look! Look! She cried, pointing eagerly. There's the White Queen, running across the country. She came flying out of the wood, over yonder. How fast those queens can run!
There's some enemy after her, no doubt,
the king said, without even looking round.
That wood's full of him.
But aren't you going to run and help her? Alice asked, very much surprised at his taking it so quietly.
No use,
said the king.
She runs so fearfully quick. You might as well try to catch a bandersnatch. But I'll make a memorandum about her, if you like.
She's a dear, good creature, he repeated softly to himself, as he opened his memorandum book.
Do you spell creature with a double E?
At this moment, the Unicorn sauntered by them, with his hands in his pockets. I had the best of it this time, he said to the king, just glancing at him as he passed.
A little,
the king replied, rather nervously.
You shouldn't have run him through with your horn, you know.
It didn't hurt him, the Unicorn said carelessly, and he was going on, when his eye happened to fall upon Alice. He turned round rather instantly, and stood for some time looking at her with an air of the deepest disgust. What is this? He said at last.
This is a child,
Hea replied eagerly, coming in front of Alice to introduce her, and spreading out both his hands towards her in an Anglo-Saxon attitude.
We only found it today. It's as large as life and twice as natural.
I have always thought they were fabulous monsters, said the Unicorn. Is it alive?
It can talk,
said Hea solemnly. The Unicorn looked dreamily at Alice, and said, Talk, child! Alice could not help her lips curling up into a smile as she began. Do you know, I have always thought unicorns were fabulous monsters too. I never saw one alive before. Well, now that we have seen each other, said the Unicorn, if you'll believe in me, I'll believe in you. Is that a bargain? Yes, if you like, said Alice. Come, fetch out the plum cake, old man, the Unicorn went on, turning from her to the king. None of your brown bread for me.
Certainly, the king muttered and beckoned to Hea. Open the bag, he whispered. Quick, not that one, that's full of hay.
Hea took a large cake out of the bag and gave it to Alice to hold, while he got out a dish and a carving knife. How they all came out of it, Alice couldn't guess. It was just like a conjuring trick, she thought. The Lion had joined them while this was going on. He looked very tired and sleepy, and his eyes were half shut.
"What's this?" he said, blinking lazily at Alice and speaking in a deep, hollow tone that sounded like the tolling of a great bell. "Ah, what is it now?" the unicorn cried eagerly. "You'll never guess. I couldn't." The lion looked at Alice wearily. "Are you an animal? Vegetable? Or mineral?" he said, yawning at every other word. "It's a fabulous monster!" the unicorn cried out before Alice could reply. "Then hand round the plum cake monster," the lion said, lying down and putting his chin on his paws. "And sit down, both of you," to the king and the unicorn. "Fair play with the cake, you know." The king was evidently very uncomfortable at having to sit down between the two great creatures, but there was no other place for him. "What a fight we might have for the crown now," the unicorn said, looking slyly up at the crown, which the poor king was nearly shaking off his head, he trembled so much. "I should win easy," said the lion. "I'm not so sure of that," said the unicorn. "Why, I beat you all round the town, you chicken," the lion replied angrily, half getting up as he spoke. Here the king interrupted to prevent the quarrel going on. He was very nervous and his voice quite quavered. "All round the town?" he said. "Oh, that's a good long way. Did you go by the old bridge or the marketplace? You get the best view by the old bridge." "I'm sure I don't know," the lion growled out as he lay down again. "There was too much dust to see anything. What a time the monster is, cutting up that cake." Alice had seated herself on the bank of a little brook, with the great dish on her knees, and was sawing away diligently with the knife. "It's very provoking," she said, in reply to the lion. She was getting quite used to being called the monster. "I've cut several slices already, but they always join on again." "You don't know how to manage looking-glass cakes," the lion remarked. "Hand it round first and cut it afterwards." This sounded nonsense, but Alice very obediently got up and carried the dish round, and the cake divided itself into 3 pieces as she did so. "Now cut it up," said the lion as she returned to her place with the empty dish. "I say, this isn't fair," cried the unicorn, as Alice sat with the knife in her hand, very much puzzled as to how to begin. "The monster has given the lion twice as much as me." "She's kept none for herself, anyhow," said the lion. "Do you like plum cake, monster?" But before Alice could answer him, the drums began. Where the noise came from she couldn't make out. The air seemed full of it, and it rang through and through her head until she felt quite deafened. She started to her feet and sprang across the little brook in her terror, and had just time to see the lion and the unicorn rise to their feet, with angry looks at being interrupted in their feast, before she dropped to her knees and put her hands over her ears, vainly trying to shut out the dreadful uproar. "If that doesn't drum them out of town," she thought to herself, "nothing ever will." End of chapter 7.